To start off part 3, it was time to make the doors and drawer faces. So I had about 24 total panels, raised panel doors or drawer faces that I needed to make. So I decided to go ahead and make all of my rail and style cuts in the beginning based off of some pretty exact calculations. After the rails and stiles were cut down to size, it was time to send them all through the router. So this was kind of nice when I could mass produce it and send all of the rails through at one time and then all of the stiles through at the same time as well. There were definitely a few errors going through this router table, as you can see on the end of that piece, but that's definitely nothing that a razor blade and some sanding can fix. Now it was time to cut the raised panels. After cutting them all down to length, I went ahead and sent them through the table saw to cut them to their exact width. Because the back of the raised panel doesn't sit flush with the back of the rails and stiles, I had to send them all through the planer. I want to say that I planed them all down to about 5/8 thickness. I accidentally left a step out, and that was routing those raised panel doors. After the raised panels were planed and routed, I went ahead and stained them. I've heard that moisture will make those panels expand and contract in the middle of the rails and stiles, so it's good to go ahead and stain them before you assemble the entire door. In order to assemble these raised panel doors, I put in some space balls. Yes, that's actually a thing. I didn't even know what they were, but they actually really helped out with the shake and the rattle of that panel if you cut it down a little bit narrower than the actual opening on the insides of the rails and stiles. When gluing up these raised panel doors, it's important to only put glue on the rails and stiles, so that way when you do have some shrinking and expanding of that raised panel, you don't get any splitting. If you notice, I put that rail a little bit proud on the edge of the stile, and what I'm doing now is I'm clamping those rails in just a little bit so that way they sit nice and flush with the stiles on the sides. Before I stained all of these, I went ahead and marked the holes and then drilled where the hinges were going to go. I wanted to do that so that way I didn't make any markings or tear anything up that I had previously stained. I decided to go ahead and fancy up the edges of these doors and drawer faces because they look kind of lame as just a squared edge. So I tilted the table saw blade to 30 degrees and then put the fence a 1/2 inch from the base of that blade right there. So you get a nice cut, nice profile edge, and it looks pretty good when it all got stained and sanded and put together. Now it was time to do the final stain on these doors. I went ahead and stained the rails and stiles, but I paid close attention to make sure and not let that stain sit too long where the rail and stiles met that raised panel in order to not get a different color. I found this application technique on YouTube as well, just throwing down some hot glue on your drawer and then holding up the raised panel so that way it would dry a little bit, hold a little bit better. Then you could pull the drawer out and then apply some clamping pressure before you decided to go ahead and drill some pilot holes and then throw some screws in the back side. The hot glue technique worked really well for me. It was just real important to make sure that those drawers were actually sticking real flush with the face frame, or else you'd have to put a big glob of glue on there in order to make it protrude out enough to hold onto that door. If you have the extra money, definitely invest in some soft close drawer glides because they are awesome. My dad wanted me to install these cable troughs underneath the back side of the desk before I put the tops on, so that way he could run cables all around the top side and they could be concealed. On the top left of your screen, there's already a hole there. Those blue pieces of tape are holes that I need to drill. Now it was time to go ahead and lay out the desktop. I went with 1x4 frames and then inlaid some mahogany plywood, and it had a really nice look in the end. Because there was so much thinking and so many different cuts involved in this step, I went ahead and planned it all out and mapped it out on the floor. Then it was time to go ahead and make the cuts. Some were 45s, some were at an angle of around 26.5 degrees. If you'd like a really detailed video on how I came up with that number and that angle, I'll put a link in the description below to my math and woodworking video where I kind of detailed the process of going through this entire step in finding out what that angle is and then making the cuts. In order to ensure that these 1x4 frame pieces glued up nice and flush, I went ahead and put some biscuits in the edges of them. and paying close attention to make sure that those biscuits would not interfere with the router when I went ahead and routed the edge. For me, gluing up these 1x4 frame pieces just seemed like a really bad process. I feel like there's a better way to do it with some clamps, and maybe there's some better 90-degree clamp that I can get that will hold a 1x4 board. So if anybody has any ideas on that, definitely let me know. I would absolutely listen to that. Now it was time to go ahead and cut the mahogany plywood tops. After first cutting the piece down to length, I went ahead and sent it through the table saw again to cut it down to the exact width after the first rough cut on the width. After some test cuts and some dry fits, I finally got a nice fit on the inside. Now it was time for the spray lacquer. I sprayed 2 coats, then did a light sand at 400 grit, then did 2 more coats, and then did a final sand of 2000 grit. Now it was time to go ahead and nail on the sub top. This was just 3/4 inch maple because I wanted to make sure it was nice and stout. So checking the square with the desk part and those 2 columns, it worked out well. I glued up as much of the 1x4 frame in my shop as I could, but I couldn't glue it all together because it would be one ginormous piece. So I went ahead and joined the 2 big chunks together with this C5 unit, and I had just a couple pieces to glue in, and it worked out really, really nicely. Now with the 1x4 frame all assembled, it was time to go ahead and route the edge on it. I went ahead and took a few light passes at it instead of one big pass because that bit is a, I want to say 2.5 inch diameter bit, and so it might really split the wood quite a bit if you take it in one pass. Now it was time to stain. I started with the entire 1x4 top, and then after that I went ahead and went down to the bottom portion and stained the face frame. After the stain dried, I applied some coats of spray lacquer, started with 2 coats and then sanded to 400 and then finished it off with another 2 coats and then did a final sanding of 2000. After I was done sanding, I just used a microfiber cloth. You can also use a t-shirt, something that's pretty lint free, to go ahead and wipe off that excess sanding of the lacquer. Now that we got everything stained and coated, it was time to go ahead and insert those mahogany plywood tops. I started by drilling some pilot holes up from the bottom, and then the plywood was just 0.05 inches thinner than the 1x4 frame itself. So I went ahead and put some washers in there that were just right at 0.05 inches, and then put some screws in, drilled from the bottom, so that way if they needed to be removed later they could, and it worked out pretty well. Thank you all for watching. A final walkthrough video will be coming up very soon where I'll just kind of walk through everything and just show you what is going on and kind of where I'm at in the process. So thank you all for checking in, and I'll see you in part 4.